Good afternoon and welcome to Are There Any Questions, where we will discuss question time in the New South Wales Parliament. My name is Daniela, and with Rowan, Australian Studies of Parliament Group Treasurer, will be your hosts tonight. It's lovely to have you join us. As I said, you'll be able to pop questions into the YouTube chat section. Each of our panellists will speak for 5 to 7 minutes each, and after they've all spoken, we'll take as many questions as we can. This event has been recorded and it will be available on the Parliament's website as soon as possible after the program. I will now ask the Honourable Jonathan O'Dea, MP, Speaker of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly and member for Davidson, to say a few words and officially open this event. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Daniela. Thank you so much, Daniela. Can I just confirm that Speaker Rosalie is not going to be joining us? Is that correct?
Speaker Rosalie is there, and he's with Rowan. He's right next to Rowan, so maybe we can just have a little wave to Speaker Rosalie.
Fantastic, Kevin. I just wanted to make sure you were there before I introduced you with the others. Thank you. Thank you so much, Daniela. And it is a real pleasure to be with you and many people online who are joining with myself and my colleagues on behalf of the New South Wales Parliament. And I wanted to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which Parliament sits. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal people who are joining us today. Question time is an essential and important proceeding of the Parliament. It allows members of Parliament to seek information from the executive arm of government, to scrutinise it and to hold it to account. Certainly in the Legislative Assembly in which I sit, our question time commences at 2:15 on sitting days. It runs for about 45 minutes. And it's been described by various people as the best free entertainment in town. During question time, opposition and government members take turns to ask questions, with one question usually reserved for the crossbench. Half of those questions are government questions, which are commonly known as Dorothy Dixes. They're pre-arranged questions that allow ministers to update the House on government policies or otherwise provide commentary. The opposition questions are a little bit more testing, and I'm sure Yasmin will speak to that quite effectively. But not long after I became Speaker of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly, as well as the Chair of the Standing Orders and Procedures Committee, we began a review of practices and procedures in the Legislative Assembly, including question time. And I know the Legislative Council undertook a similar exercise. But in the Legislative Assembly, we came up with some bold and innovative ideas, including restructuring government questions, shortening answers, and making proceedings more dynamic. We even contemplated the possibility of crowdsourcing questions from members of the public, hoping to engage them more with their house, which we sometimes call, or often call, the People's House. And at a time where public trust in institutions and politics is at an unfortunate historic low, it is more crucial than ever that we update our practices and our procedures to meet public expectations in an effective way. In today's forum, we'll hear from people with experience and expertise in these practices and procedures, and we'll explore perhaps how we could do a little better. And I'd like to now introduce you to the panellists for today's discussion. Firstly, we have the Honourable Kevin Rosalie. Kevin was a former member of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly for 30 years and the Speaker of the Parliament from 1988 to 1995, when he oversaw a major rewrite of the Standing Orders. His recent contribution to the Commonwealth Parliamentary Committee's inquiry into question time received a special acknowledgement in that inquiry's final report. Next, we have Yasmin Catley, who's the member for Swansea in my house and a member of the Labor opposition, who until recently also served as the Deputy Leader. We also have David Shoebridge. David's a Greens member, and he's in the Legislative Council, as well as being the chair of the Council's Public Accountability Committee. Thanks, David. Prior to his parliamentary career, David also served as a local government councillor remember, we all have to vote this Saturday, and also as a barrister. He certainly uses that expertise, and will be shortly moving to the federal parliament, to all things going to plan, David, but thank you for your contribution to the state. And last but not least is Professor Rodney Smith. Professor Smith teaches at the University of Sydney, where he's the interim head of the School of Social and Political Sciences. His research interests include Australian politics, political and public sector ethics, and parliaments. So I welcome all four panel members and thank them for their generous dedication of time and expertise and knowledge. And now I'll hand back to Daniela, our Senior Education Officer, who will facilitate today's discussion along with Rowan. Thank you, Daniela.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for your warm welcome and for introducing our guest speakers. I'll now ask Rowan to speak briefly about the Australian Studies of Parliament group.
Hello, my name is Rowan Taylor and I am the Secretary-Treasurer to the New South Wales chapter of the Australasian Study of Parliament group, otherwise known as the ASPG. On behalf of the New South Wales chapter, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to Mr. Speaker and our panellists for making the time to participate in this panel discussion on question time and sharing with us their unique insights on the topic. I would also like to thank Daniela, Scarlett and all the team from the New South Wales Parliament Communications, Engagement and Education branch for partnering with the ASPG in this event and for their expertise, professionalism and hard work in bringing this to life. The ASPG is a politically non-partisan body which was established in 1978 to encourage and stimulate research, writing, teaching and discussion about parliamentary institutions, particularly those in Australasia and the South Pacific. The ASPG has chapters in all states and territories of Australia and in New Zealand, and membership consists of parliamentarians, parliamentary officers, academics, teachers, journalists, students, and any other interested individual. If you're not already a member of the New South Wales chapter and you're interested in joining, I'd love to hear from you. Look, thank you very much again, and thank you, Daniela.
Thank you, Rowan. Well, let's begin. We'll now hear from each of our panel members. So I'd like to ask the Honourable Kevin Rosalie to speak first. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, Speaker Rosalie.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here, and it's great to be back in the old building in a very active capacity. I was very interested in the speaker's introduction, and I might find that with a little bit of questioning in what I have to say about some of the things that he said, but that's just the way it goes. I just start off by saying that question time should be one of the simplest procedures that the Parliament actually has. It's there to give backbench members a chance to ask questions of ministers, basically relating to their constituency, rather than the point that was made earlier that it was about much more general matters of parliamentary or government activity. However, I'd just like to say that question time has changed dramatically since when I came in, which is now 50 years ago or so. And because of that, it has provided a window on the activities of Parliament which is less than desirable. And I've got a belief that Parliament suffers from this, and suffers because question time has become the lens through which Parliament is judged. Now, if we're going to overcome this problem and create a better impression of Parliament, then we have to look at the way in which we handle Parliament, and perhaps to get back more to the fundamentals of what question time was all about. I believe if we could do this, we would in fact increase the public opinion of Parliament, because they would see Parliament as something that had a certain amount of decorum and a certain amount of dignity. The way of doing this is perhaps very controversial, and Speaker O'Day did mention the Dorothy Dixes, which come from the government side, and they have become one of the most corrosive elements in the conduct of Parliament, and are, as much as anything, responsible for the bad behaviour which is often, too often, seen by the public. Now, when I came in to Parliament, which was in 1973, Dorothy Dixes really didn't exist. If a minister wanted to get a question up, he would spread it around amongst 3, 4, 5 members of the government, backbench members of the government, in the hope that one of them would get the call, because the Speaker's intention in those days, and the accepted intention of question time, was that all members during a parliamentary session would have an opportunity to ask a question on behalf of their constituency, and the Speaker would be meticulous in keeping a tally of the questions that were asked and make sure that those questions were spread around all the backbench members. If I remember rightly, it was about, you got about 3 questions at least in any one parliamentary session. Now, this was good for the local member because it enabled him to raise, or her to raise, a matter which was of public interest in his electorate or her electorate, and to get show the electorate that he was in fact right on the hammer of things that were important to them. So if we want to go to remedy the situation that we have now, we have to really try and ameliorate the corrosive influence of the Dorothy Dixer. And I think we can do that by 2 mechanisms. One is to go back to the one I was just talking about, which is that you share the meetings round. There is no predictability in who will get the call, other than if someone has already had quite a number of calls, they mightn't get any more. But the second thing is that we have to try and get away from the power of the strategists in Parliament who design question time. Now, it's not only the government who asked Dorothy Dixes. In a sense, the opposition asked its own form of Dorothy Dixes, and they structure the question time so that it follows a pattern of the opposition's idea of what will in fact be useful to them as a parliamentary opposition. Now, the problem with that is that it's almost invariably the strategists get it wrong. And I spent some time on the strategy committee of the Liberal Party at one stage, and I was always at loggerheads over them, telling them they were going the wrong way about it. They never took any notice of me, and they kept stumbling on because what mostly they do is they pick up the important matters that the media considers are important matters of the day. And therefore, Dorothy Dixes have no surprise element. Everyone knows the question, the area in which the questions are going to be asked, and therefore the government is prepared for them, or the opposition can almost anticipate what the government's going to say, and there's very little real newsworthiness in it. And what the strategists, or what should be done, in fact, is for either side, the way they shape their question time, to build it over a period of time by putting in a number of innocuous or seemingly innocuous questions, but questions which are important to elicit information which will lead up to some sort of climax. I haven't got time to go into this in great detail. It's just a brief suggestion of how this might be achieved. The present practice just, in fact, cheapens the cut and thrust of question time, which in my early days was much more interesting, was much more unpredictable, and I think actually was much more productive. The next thing I'd just like to say is that I think we need to increase the power that the Speaker has to control question time. Now, the Speaker is the servant of the House, and he might be the boss of running the show, but the rules are given to him by the House, and therefore he can only, or she can only, operate under those particular standing orders. And I think that it's very important for the Speaker to try and control question time in a way which helps to raise the dignity of the Parliament, But I think I know the standing orders here at Parliament quite well, that there is a need for changes to strengthen the Speaker's capacity to do this. Of course, this will be opposed by the government of the day, and this is always the way it goes. But there should be some general consensus between government and opposition about these matters, because no party stays in power all the time. It swaps backwards and forwards, and so if it is generally in the interest of the Parliament, then it's interested in both the parties. So I think that one of the first things we should do is to look at the fact that the rules about asking questions are very restrict. And it says that they should not contain things like argument, inference, imputations, insults, or ironical expressions. In other words, the sort of explosive, derogatory sort of approach, which is damaging. But you won't find anything in the standing orders that controls the way in which questions are answered. And I think the same rule should be applied to the answers given by ministers, that that the answers should not contain argument, inference, imputation, insults, ironical expression, etc. And if the Speaker had a specific power in which to intervene and stop a minister from doing that, then things would greatly improve. Now, Neville Wran in his day was a great master of this imputations, insults, and ironical expressions, and he used to use this to sort of intimidate the opposition into not asking certain types of questions or making certain approaches, or indeed just to waste time so he didn't have to answer the question. Now, if the Speaker has the power to control that and to draw the minister back to answering the exact question that's been asked, then I think you would get much better outcomes. And I think the Parliament should look more at that basic purpose of question time, which is to elicit facts. I think I must be running out of time shortly. Elicit facts, and the Speaker should have the power to draw ministers back to deliberating on the or to talking about the facts. It should, if a question is it raises a matter which is like a question about which is a person, another member of Parliament, usually in a derogatory fashion, or a member of the general public, then that should be ruled out of order straight away, and the questioner should be told that should be raised by substantive motion, and that question would be ruled out as being taken into account in the tally for questions on that particular day. And I think the same thing should apply to, and this was mentioned by the Speaker, about Dorothy Dix as being opportunities for the minister to give statements on policy. Well, question time is not about stating government policy. And I would change the standing orders so that the Speaker could rule that sort of question out of order, and by deeming that it was in fact the subject of a ministerial statement, and set that down as a ministerial statement for the following sitting day. And again, that question should be, as well as being ruled out, should not count in the number of questions that have been asked on that particular day. So I'll finish up there because I think I've probably spoken too long anyhow, but I hope there's something there that will spark some debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rosalie, for those really thoughtful insights into the role of Speaker and your experiences of question time as a former Speaker. And I think question time is starting to sound to me like it's the topic for a book, and a really interesting book at that. So I'd like to now ask Ms. Yasmin Catley, the member for Swansea, to present. Thank you so much, Ms. Catley, for being on the panel today.
Oh, thank you so much, Daniela, for having me, and I thank you and Rowan for organising this. I think that these sessions are really important, and I hope all members participate because I think they're quite valuable. I'd also like to thank Mr. Rosalie. I haven't met you before, Mr. Rosalie, but you are quite famous in our question times and often referred to some of your rulings. So it's lovely to meet you virtually. I'd too like to acknowledge the Indigenous people of the nation that I'm on at the moment, which is the Awabakal people, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. Look, as I said, it's a great opportunity to join everyone to discuss what has become an important institution for our democracy, and that is question time. I thought that I might just start with a little bit of history, and I want to thank you for asking me because it made me actually do a bit of research, which I have thoroughly enjoyed. So thanks for asking me to participate. The original standing orders of the New South Wales Parliament didn't actually have any provisions for questions without notice to a minister. And instead, the practice of the House of Commons was adopted in which notice was required to put a question to a minister. But the ministers, of course, could agree to answer a question without notice on the basis that nothing in the standing orders forbid it. And that occurred when the Attorney General answered a question without notice in the very first Parliament. So it has a long, long tradition. In the 19th century, questions without notice were used to obtain urgent information from the government. So that is still tried in practice, but as we've just heard from Mr. Rosalie, not necessarily getting the correct answers or an answer indeed at all. But in 1915, question time was only for 30 minutes. So, Mr. Speaker, that might be something we could discuss as well. But the 30-minute time limit was extended to all sitting days in 1928. More recently, in 1991, a number of significant reforms were made to the standing orders that produced the question time format that basically we have today. And the standing orders established that the minimum of 10 questions had to be asked, and the first question goes to the Leader of the Opposition, and that still stands today as well. On government business days, the public interest debate was also established, and that was to bring forth other matters of public importance, urgent public importance, in line with the original intention of questions without notice. Government ministers now have only 35 days to answer those questions on notice to help improve the scrutiny of the government. Both the format of question time and its role within our parliamentary institution has changed since its inception. Today, the political parties use question time, as has been described to you, to try to expose the government on its failings. That's certainly what the opposition tries to do. And we've had Mr. Rosalie describe strategy, and he's 100% right. That is the strategy that is used to try and expose the government's failings and to catch out a minister on detailing their portfolio and to build a political narrative, and the government employ backbenchers to ask questions to enhance, which are Dorothy Dix's, to allow them to highlight their policies and to attack the opposition. So I think Mr. Rosalie has been able to describe that very clear to us, that these are political strategies that often, as Mr. Rosalie quite rightly said, the government already know the answer, and the tactics are not necessarily as successful as certainly the opposition had hoped. But it's certainly been my observation that every political leader has a different approach to question time and how best that it can be used. As Mr. Rosalie also said, and I think that the first intention of question time was the right one, and that's where members on both sides can ask questions. And certainly from the opposition's perspective, I had always encouraged members when I was in a leadership role to participate in providing questions so that they can go back to their electorates and demonstrate that they have asked a question of a minister in the Parliament. And I myself have had the opportunity to do that, not very often, unfortunately. And it really is something that I think is valuable as a local member, but also valuable for your party to know that you are really prosecuting something within your local area. And often too, it will be backed up. Like when it was when I had that opportunity, I had media lined up, I had third parties lined up, and we really were able to use that quite successfully for the electorate to achieve good outcomes. So whilst question time often garners the most media attention and sometimes not so great, unfortunately, and of course public attention of any of the other activities in the House, it also, as has also been described, produces a lot of cynicism and disenchantment with politics. And that's what we need to change. The conduct of the chamber highlights politics at its most partisan and in many ways distorts the reality of the working relationship between members of parties and indeed of politicians right across the board. In COVID-19, the pandemic has had some interesting impacts on question time. We really have turned things on its head from time to time, and they have been from limiting the amount of members in the chamber and even reducing the number of questions, leading to the elimination of Dixes from the government at one stage. So that was they were about 30 minutes question time at those points in time in actual fact. Now, this placed an emphasis back on using question time to scrutinise the administration of the government, with restrictions easing question time to return to its regular format, though, of course. So question time in the Parliament of New South Wales differs from what we see in the federal Parliament, and that being that members, when asked a question, are also able to seek an additional 2-minute extension for further information from the Minister. And should the Minister's answer exceed the original 5-minute limit, that happens all the time with Dixes, and sometimes with that is also practice from the opposition when they're asking the government a question, when they can see it as time to ask for further information if the answer has not provided, the original answer has not provided enough information, or indeed if they believe that there's something further to investigate from the original question that was asked. Now, it's very important to have a good balanced speaker. I think that a good balanced speaker cannot be underestimated, in fact, in question time, which Mr. Rosalie also alluded to. It means the functioning and of the question time and holding the government account and not descending into chaos is critically important, and a well-balanced speaker can certainly achieve that. In New South Wales, we're very lucky to have a good balanced speaker in Jonathan O'Dea, and we thank him for that. But not all of his predecessors have been able to retain that respect on all sides of politics. And but what we have seen, certainly in our federal parliament, is the fantastic job that Tony Smith has done. And that was particularly after the challenges faced by his successor, Andrew Wallace. And he has been tested by both sides of politics. Can I say the Speaker's job is a really difficult one, but it is so critical to the institution of question time. And we do thank all of our speakers, certainly our most present one, Speaker O'Dea, and as I've said from my opening remarks, Speaker Rosalie was certainly quite a formidable speaker, and one who is still spoken of today very highly. So we thank you as well. So over the past century, question time has evolved significantly into the format that we see today. And I agree with Mr. Rosalie that there's room for improvement. The evolution of party politics has shaped question time into the most partisan period of each sitting day. And while the format has evolved, at its core, question time is still used by the opposition to pursue the government over its failures of administration. Can I say that question time, or the bear pit, as it is known, is renowned for robust question times. And it's not until you sit on that green leather that you really understand just how loud it is in there and how robust that conversation or that exchange of question time is. It is a very unique environment in comparison to other parliaments. We're extremely close to one another. and as a result, you know, it is incredibly robust. I don't know another word to describe it. It can become quite intimidating, intense, and incredibly loud. I think that there's always room for improvement in anything we do, and I think having these discussions and sharing our experience with others can only open up that conversation, and I hope that it does. And I'm more than happy to be part of something to make question time in any part of our Parliament better. Thanks again for having me, and I would be happy to participate in whatever it is the Parliament is doing. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ms. Catley, for sharing your perspective on question time, and in particular that historical perspective, as well as experience in opposition and as a local member. That's very interesting for our audiences. And I'll just remind our audience that they can type questions for one or all of our members of the panel into the chat section for us to answer in a few minutes. Our next panellist, Mr. David Shoebridge, MLC, will tell us a little bit about question time in the Legislative Council. And so we've heard about the Legislative Assembly perspective on question time. This is the upper house, so we've heard about the role of the Speaker in the lower house. Of course, in the upper house, the presiding officer is the President. So that's Mr. Shoebridge will perhaps tell us a little bit about question time in the upper house. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Daniela. And I'll start by acknowledging I'm coming to you from Gadigal land and pay my respects to the elders past, present, emerging. The land I'm on, the land the Parliament is on, is Gadigal land, and we have a long way to go to walk with First Nations peoples towards truth, treaty and self-determination. So first of all, I'm not much of a believer in question time. I actually think question time should be, if we're going to continue with the institution, the first thing we should do is rename it answer time. If it was answer time, I reckon it'd be worthwhile. More people would turn up, and it would put the focus where it should be, on actually providing information. But it's not, it's question time. So I'm in the upper house. It's a smaller chamber. We have 42 members. I can't keep track of how many are downstairs, about 96 or so, I think, downstairs. But in the upper house, it's 42 members. We're presided over by a president who takes the role of the Speaker. And I would like to acknowledge both the former Speaker and the current Speaker for their contributions. And indeed, I do want to acknowledge the current Speaker, Jonathan O'Dea's actual work in trying to sort of educate MPs and drag us along a journey to try and make the institution better. I think we've all been noticing that, Jonathan, and thanks for your work. And also my parliamentary colleague, Yasmin Catley. But look, I actually, so in the upper house, it's 42 members. It's less aggressive than it is downstairs. We have to get on a bit more because the government does not have a guaranteed majority. In fact, if you looked at the votes this last 2 years, you'd probably say a very long way from a guaranteed majority in the upper house. So things have to be negotiated more. So you have to work across the aisle, establish relationships, and that does change the nature of the institution. It still has competitive politics. I don't want to pretend otherwise, but it tends to be more collegiate. We tend to have more experience working across the aisle to find common ground than you see downstairs. And that's simply the fact that the government doesn't have an absolute majority to ram stuff through. I've been in the same chamber in different parliamentary terms where the government had a very clear majority with just a handful of crossbench MPs, notably Fred Nile and his team. And when they had the numbers, they would just ram things through in the upper house. But nevertheless, there has been a very distinct different culture in the upper house, and it tends to be more collegiate. So in the last 2 years, we've done a number of reforms on question time in the upper house. One of the things we've done is change the rule so that answers have to be, instead of generally relevant, but actually directly relevant. And we've empowered the President, who presides over the chambers, to be pretty tough on that. So often you'll hear a question downstairs in the Legislative Assembly, a question, say, for example, asking about a defective train or something. And then you'll get a rant from the Minister about investment in trains and trains more broadly. And provided it's within the sort of, generally relevant to trains, it tends to be permitted downstairs. We did have that in the upper house too, but to be honest, that's not answering the question. It's not even pretending to answer the question. So we changed the rules and said answers have to be directly relevant. And that has made a change. It has made the answers more useful. It's got rid of some of the excessive kind of politicized ranting that you tend to get in answers, and has focused it a little more. We've also introduced, we also have a very clear and a much easier way of asking a supplementary question. So you'll get an answer. It might answer part of your question, or it might, you know, tiptoe around and try and avoid the key part of the question that has been asked. And then that member, or a member of that the same party as that member, can ask a supplementary question, and can, in asking a supplementary question, can try and elicit some additional information. Well, you know, you said X. Can you please explain, you know, more about X? Can you please explain how, you know, X is actually accurate given Y? You know, and that can be useful because it allows things to be drawn out. And then we've created a new rule which allows for a second supplementary question, and that can be asked by somebody who's not from the same political party. So quite often you'll hear a question will be put, you'll get a first answer, you'll get a little drib and drab more in a supplementary, and then you'll be sitting there and you'll be thinking, hang on, this raises this additional point. And we now have the capacity for that to be put as a second supplementary, to go, well, you said X and Y, what about this? And get some additional answers. And I think that has improved things. And it does mean that there's more of that sort of consistent questioning on a particular point, which is more likely to get, you know, uncover a problem or highlight a deficiency, or sometimes, you know, even get an adequate and full answer to an issue which explains the government's position. And I do think that consistency, and I think the former speaker spoke about this before, about how sometimes you need to be persistent on something. You need to, it's not just one question. You need to sort of build a foundation, ask a follow-up question, and then then eventually, you know, get to the, I was going to say meat of the question, the tofu of the question. I'm a Greens MP. Get to the tofu of the question. So I think that improves question time. I don't think it's a solution to question time. I still think, given the complexity of government, given the complexity of issues, question time tends to be more theatre than accountability. And I think it's played as theatre. You know, I'm as guilty as anybody else. You ask a question because you've lined up something with a media outlet to run the question and answer. And as often it's as much about the question as it is about the answer. An element of that is healthy in a democracy, but I don't think we should pretend that question time, either how it's played out in the lower house in New South Wales Parliament or how it's played out in the upper house in New South Wales Parliament. And I do want to stress, I think the upper house has slightly improved practices, but I don't think either of them are really some sort of magic accountability tool. They have a limited part to play, but I do think sometimes the public sees it as the only accountability tool. I personally think things like budget estimates and more prolonged questioning of ministers is far, far more useful. And but nevertheless, that's how it works. It's gone a little way in the upper house, further work to go. I'd be really interested to hear Rodney's sort of more objective perspective on how the whole thing is working. So thanks, Danielle.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shoebridge, for those insights into question time from the upper house, and in particular the reforms, the recent reforms to question times in that house. And now I'd like to introduce or ask our final member, Professor Rodney Smith of the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Sydney. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor, and perhaps you can give us the academic perspective.
Oh, well, I think we've heard some very good contributions, very thoughtful contributions. I'll try and be brief to allow for questions from our audience. I think it's true that question time in Westminster parliaments around the world, not just in New South Wales, are a cause of public misinformation about most of what parliaments do, and public negativity towards parliaments. It's not just in New South Wales that there's a problem. And New South Wales isn't, I mean, I know it was mentioned before that the New South Wales Legislative Assembly has a very highly combative question time, but it's not uniquely so, I don't think. There are common complaints in Canada, in the UK, about exactly the same sorts of issues around question time. So it's not just a New South Wales problem. So what can be done about it is the interesting question, and maybe nothing much can be done about it, but perhaps there are some things that can be done about it. And there's kind of really two approaches, broadly speaking, that we might look to. And the first one, I think, was outlined well by Kevin Rosalie earlier, which is to look at behavioural norms and to try and change the behavioural norms around the speaker, around the party strategists and so on. So improve the behaviour without necessarily changing much of the rules. And that might work to some extent, it seems to me, but you've got to ask, why did that behaviour develop? What's driving it, and is that likely to change? And the second approach is to change the rules. And I think as Mr. Shoebridge said, David Shoebridge said, there's a contest here, a real contest here between the executive and the opposition and crossbench MPs, executive and parliament, if you like, but truly between the executive and the non-executive MPs. And that's why the rules are different in the two houses, as was indicated. So, changing the rules gives speakers, gives presidents more or less latitude really to deal with behaviour, it seems to me. So what might be done? Just 5 quick suggestions drawing on experience from some other Westminster parliaments, or indeed the first one deals with the Legislative Council. I mean, one is the reform to the standing orders or the sessional orders to make answers directly relevant, and we've heard that elaborated, and certainly in a recent forum for some University of Sydney students, John Ajaka pointed to that as being, as former president of the Legislative Council, as being a very important element in improving question time. So that's a relatively straightforward change in many respects. Perhaps a more radical change might be just to have questions from opposition and crossbench MPs. In other words, to say that government MPs don't get to ask questions. Government backbenchers, if they're going to waste time asking Dorothy Dixer, shouldn't get the chance to ask questions. There are some parliaments which have experimented with this, including the Victorian Parliament, and it's consistent with the behaviour of government MLCs in the estimates committees. By and large, they leave the estimates committee work in terms of asking questions to the opposition and the crossbench. So why not extend that to the to question time? Another reform might be shorter answers. Currently in the Legislative Assembly, as was mentioned before, an answer can run for 5 minutes and then be extended by another 2 minutes. And I've listened to a number of those answers over the years, and they are very much ministerial statements. They're not dynamic. There's often not a lot of information there that couldn't be delivered much more quickly, or alternatively, again, as was suggested earlier, shifted to the period of parliamentary business where ministers get to make their own statements. So how short should the answers be? The Canadian House of Commons has a rule, 35 seconds for a question, 35 seconds for an answer. Now that might be too short and sharp for our liking, but there's probably a midpoint somewhere between that and 7 minutes potentially that would produce a more dynamic question time that's still allowed for the scrutiny of the executive. Another suggestion might be to have a rota of ministers being questioned. In other words, rather than questions being addressed to the minister who happens to be on the front page of the Daily Telegraph that day, to have questions allocated to ministers on a rota basis, so that we know that in a particular question time it's going to be questions to the Minister for Agriculture or the Minister for Education, because it seems to me that the gotcha element of question time, the media-driven element of question time, means that a lot of areas of government administration, government policy basically go under scrutinised in question time. So maybe a rota, as is used in, for example, the UK House of Commons might be used there. And finally, what about providing questions in advance, or at least the initial question in advance to ministers to allow them to develop a more considered response? How much time in advance might they need? In the House of Commons in the UK, it's 3 days. They're given 3 days. In the New Zealand House of Representatives, they're given about 2.5 hours notice. It's probably enough time. Somewhere between those two is probably enough time. But the point about that is to, if we're after scrutiny, if we're after considered responses, that allows those to be developed, and then there's always the possibility for follow-on questions if the minister doesn't answer the question. So there are 5 kind of ways that question time might be reformed, particularly for the Legislative Assembly, but also the Legislative Council. They're methods that have been used in other parliaments. They're not silver bullets, and they would still leave the necessity for presiding members and party strategists to behave themselves to some degree, but they would encourage better behaviour, I think, perhaps. Anyway, I throw those out there as thoughts for possible reforms. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Smith, for those insights into parliamentary question time in our Westminster system of government, and particularly the comparison with other Australian and Westminster parliaments, and also, of course, our committee process. So thank you very much to all of the panelists. Some really insightful and interesting perspectives on question time, both in the upper house and the lower house. And thank you to our audience, because we do have a few questions so far. So please type in as many as you like, and we'll try to get to as many as possible in the next 15 minutes before 6 p.m. So Rowan, I believe you have a really interesting question there. Would you like to ask the first question of the panel? And of course, questions can be to an individual member of the panel or to all members of the panel. And depending on the length of the answers, just like in the real question time, we'll see how many questions we can fit in.
Thanks, Daniela. Look, the first question, I think it's been touched on by some of our panelists, but the question is, does the panel agree that consideration should be given to introducing a standing order similar to that which exists in the New Zealand Parliament that governs the content of answers, ensuring relevance? And Mr. Shoebridge covered that. And so, look, I'll throw it open to the panel.
So
Mr.
perhaps
Rosalie, would you like to?
Yeah,
we can answer in the order that we spoke would be great.
Well, I mean, the standing orders as they are now generally require that anything that is said within the Parliament should be relevant to the subject matter. It's a matter then of saying, is that enough power for the Speaker to intervene and say to a minister, look, this is irrelevant, please come back to the subject matter? Or should we in fact give the Speaker a bit more specific power so that it says to the ministers, look, if you aren't relevant, then you'll be pulled up. So it's a dicey one to know. Relevance is a sort of bit like how long's a piece of string. So it's a matter of how it's handled, I think, rather than necessarily how it's specifically referred to in the standing orders.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Speaker Rosalie.
Look, I agree with former Speaker Rosalie, and we've spoken about this quite a bit tonight, and everybody's commented on it, and we're all of the same view that it's often the case that questions are not, or answers rather, are not related to the question or answering the question. Look, I actually think that you have to change the culture across the board. And there has to be a bipartisan approach. So until such time as we get to that point, then we're going to have, it'll be people's subjective view on this, that, and the other. And unfortunately, that's how I think that it will be until such time as we change the culture. And I, for one, would like to see the culture change. And I think some of the ideas, particularly that Rodney suggested, we should investigate looking at those and perhaps implementing, a system that we do actually hold the government to account and get answers that are actually relevant to the questions that are being asked.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to speak against culture change. I think that's really important. But I have noticed we changed the rules in the upper house and it's better. We said it has to be directly relevant. I agree the question is, how long is a piece of string? But we can tell the difference between a piece of string and a garden hose. And actually giving the Speaker the power to do that is actually really useful. You trust your Speaker, you trust your President, you vote them in, and then you give them some power to make answers directly relevant. It's worked in the LC. I'd urge you to try and get it to downstairs. And actually changing the rules actually works in my view, it works in the interest of culture change too, because it stops some of that rant, it stops some of that highly politicised grandstanding. You got to focus on the question and you've got to deliver a directly relevant answer.
Danielle, I wasn't going to chime in.
Please do.
And I'm,
Yes, please.
I'm not going to overly, because I'm trying to maintain the impartiality of the speakership. And some of my introductory comments were a bit tamed as well, compared to some of the discussions that have taken place in the Standing Orders and Procedures Committee. I just wanted to, for the benefit of encouraging the fantastic discussion from the panelists, just say that, I mean, 4 of the 5 suggestions that Rodney put forward have been actively canvassed and proposed through that Standing Orders and Procedures Committee. The problem, as I see it, and I don't want to get too involved in the discussion, is that even when the Speaker votes with the opposition to support changes, which happened in my case recently, when the government didn't have the numbers on the floor, the executive arm of government controls the numbers on the floor of the House. And so unless you have bipartisan support for changes, they will not happen. I'll just make that observation that a number of speakers have made, and it comes down to the power of the Parliament versus the executive. I'm not going to contribute further, but thank you.
Thank you. Professor Smith, did you want to add to that?
Not really. I think I covered it earlier. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the answers to that lovely question. I've got a question here from one of our audience members. The LC has a lot of supplementary questions, and you hear a lot of, can you please elucidate? You rarely hear this in the Legislative Assembly. Why is this?
I'll speak briefly to the LC. Can you please elucidate? You know, the rules used to say you can have a supplementary provided it's elucidating, trying to get more information about the previous answer. We've thankfully stopped using elucidate on every single supplementary question. It was somehow used as a sort of magical way of making it a supplementary question, if you use that word. Basically now that's a substantive test. If you really are asking for additional information about some part of the answer you got, then it's within, and it'll be ruled in order. If you're asking a whole fresh question, then it'll be ruled out of order. And I'm hoping we hear a lot less of the use of the word elucidate, and we just kind of focus on the question, which is, are you asking for some additional information about the answer that's being given? But yeah, that's the history there.
Yasmin, is there a history of the word elucidate in the Legislative Assembly?
Look, not that I'm aware of, but I'm sure that former Speaker Rosalie may know the answer to that question, and I too would be interested in hearing that. But yeah, I mean, like David said, it's just seeking further information, and yeah, let's just ask it what we actually want to ask, and that would obviously make sense for all of us. But I'm sure that former Speaker Rosalie will be able to elucidate us.
Yeah, I think former Speaker Rosalie, if you could elucidate on your earlier answer, and that would be great.
Well, I think the simple answer is that in the Legislative Assembly, you only get one supplementary, and I think they are a bit more tightly controlled as to what is appropriate as a supplementary question. But if we could look at the House of Commons practice, they have a rather unusual practice where the first question that's asked is a fairly nominal question, and then the real questions that are asked are subsequently raised. There can be up to 2, 3, or say 4 questions, depending on the gravity of the subject matter, which can be asked. So this question of how you tackle the position of extracting genuine information on subject matter is a very interesting one. I think should be explored more, and today we don't have the time to do that. The other thing is that human nature being what it is, every time you put up a system which seems to be almost foolproof, immediately people start to work out how you can break down the foolproof system. So I think this needs a lot of discussion, and I think it's a very fruitful area to discuss. But I take up the point about it should be called answer time rather than question time, but unfortunately you can't have an answer without a question. So you're really locked into the two things. But I think the answer to that particular point is to make question time more valid in terms of extracting genuine information rather than being used as a theatre for the entertainment of the media, which is, I think, what it is today.
Thank you, all of you. I do have a question about the media, which I will ask in a moment, but I believe that Rowan, you've got a question there.
I do, and this is one for perhaps Mr. Speaker and Mr. Rosalie to take on. So, does the rapid and sometimes frantic nature of question time make it difficult for the Speaker to make quick decisions about ruling something in or out of order?
And can I add to that? I think we had a mention of the Speaker's rulings as well. Perhaps if the Speaker and Mr. Rosalie could also explain what a Speaker's ruling is for any of our audience, as well as that question from Rowan. Thank you.
Well, the Speaker's rulings are not absolute rules of the Parliament. The absolute rules of the standing orders, but standing orders often require a certain amount of interpretation, and these form the basis of Speaker's rulings. Now, depending on the quality of the Speaker, and I've seen a few poor Speakers in my time, they can often, the Speaker's rulings often drift away from the reality of what the original problem was. But so what I was trying to get at earlier on was that whereas a ruling is a discretionary sort of thing and could in fact lead to, I suppose, in an extreme case, no confidence in the Speaker for having grossly misinterpreted the standing order or something like that. If it is specifically written into the standing order, then it isn't subject to that sort of challenge. I don't know whether Speaker O'Dea wants to make any further comment on that. I'd be interested to hear from his much more recent experience of the chamber how he feels about it.
Look, in terms of answering the question, yes, sometimes you have to respond intuitively, but if you do that, then it's advisable and wise to know the standing orders and to be across previous rulings, or at least have an idea of sensible, wise previous rulings from people like Kevin Rosalie. So thank you.
And sorry, Rowan, if you wanted to just repeat your question from the audience member, just so that we can add to that, to the rulings question.
Oh no! Look, I think Mr. Speaker,
that was fine. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Oh, Daniela, you're on mute. Someone had to say it.
Thank you. I've got a question for perhaps the whole panel. We discussed the idea of the influence of the media on question time. And I know that former Speaker Rosalie was the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly when television was introduced into the Legislative Assembly chamber. So I'm wondering from that perspective how question time might have changed from when there was no television in the chamber, and also then with the other members, what impact do you think the fact that we are televising question time has on the procedure of question time in our Parliament?
I think the quick answer is that when we introduced television in the chamber, the press then vacated the press gallery and took all their information from the television feed, which gave them often a very inaccurate picture of what was happening in the chamber. My simple answer would be to, and I don't know whether this is physically possible, but would be to block the feed to the media during question time and force them back into being physically present in the chamber. Now, I know that's difficult because they explained to me that there are deadlines they have to meet, and that's a problem for them. They just don't have time to sit in the gallery and then go back and regurgitate it. But that's their problem, not the Parliament's problem. And if the Parliament feels that it is better to have the press gallery present in the chamber to hear what's going on than hear it through the feed, then that's what it should be.
It's nice to follow on from that, because a real life experience, Mr. Rosalie, is if all the press gallery are in the chamber for question time, then you know there's something on. So it really does have a big influence. There's no doubt about it. And I think too, you know, that the press ask for certain types of questions, certainly from the opposition, to be asked if there's a story at hand. So they play a significant role. And, you know, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Depends what your purpose for question time is. If it's to prosecute the government and to ask questions and to get real answers, then that doesn't meet that objective. It meets the objective like former Speaker Rosalie spoke about earlier, and that is that question time has been hijacked by you know, the media cycle and supposed strategy.
Yeah, well, look, I think it's an important thing. It's an important part of it, ensuring that what actually happens in Parliament is actually communicated to the public. So I think it's an essential part of it. The danger is, you know, it's like when you observe an event, you actually change the event. And an observed event is going to be different from an unobserved event. But and we see that in politics. But look, I think it's, for me, it can be a very useful tool. You can say to the media, well, look, I'm going to ask a question on X. You know, we've got a bunch of material here. There's some documents that back it up. We'll see what kind of answer we get. And so people are on notice, and then you actually shine a light on a particular problem. So I think it can be helpful. I also think it's one way of, you would hope, holding, it hasn't proven to be the case, but you would hope that having it observed would change the conduct of MPs and actually make their behaviour better. That hasn't proven to be the case, but you would hope that there might be an element of that going forward. But it also does create that theatre moment. You know, it takes us away from the idea of there being a constitutional role for Parliament to hold the government of the day, the executive, to account. So I think it works both ways, but it's by and large good having the media cover it.
Professor Smith, did you want to add to that?
Oh, look, I think I'd just say that it's largely a problem with the visuals and the sound that goes with the visuals, in the sense that printed, whether it's electronic or traditional old school paper, print media is going to be able to do its job regardless of whether or not question time is televised or broadcast. But I think you can see the performative element of question time has been modified by where the cameras are. I mean, when you see the Premier, any Premier, answer the question, where do they look? Do they look to the Speaker or even to the opposition? They look to the camera. Who are they addressing? They're addressing the people of New South Wales, perhaps the people of Australia. So, you know, I think it's certainly changed that performative element, and the television news in the evening reflects that.
Thank you. And look, thank you so much. That's all the questions we have time for tonight, I'm afraid. But perhaps everyone can join me in giving our guest speakers a virtual round of applause. It's been absolutely wonderful to hear those experiences from such a wide variety of points of view in our Parliament, and also from an academic perspective. So thank you once again to the panelists. I always find these programs really enlightening. I learn so much, and there is so much to learn, but also making such complex issues really interesting and really easy for us to understand from that perspective in the chamber is absolutely wonderful. So thank you everybody again. I really applaud you, and thank you so much for taking the time out from what I know is very, very busy time for all of you tonight. Thank you. And also a really big thank you to our audience. Obviously, we can't run these programs without an audience. It's really important that people participate. So thank you so much for your participation. The recording for this event will be available very soon on the Parliament's website. Please feel free to pass it on to anyone else who you think might be interested in listening to this discussion. And as one of our panel members and all of our panel members said, I think it's the discussion that allows for reform in future. So it's wonderful to have had this discussion tonight. Thank you, everybody, and wishing you all a good night.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.